Welcome to another episode of the Abundant Wellness Podcast. We have the immense privilege of having Michelle Moore here, a licensed mental health counselor and neurofeedback practitioner. And we're going to be talking all about postpartum today, postpartum mental health, that postpartum experience. We're going to be sharing a little bit of our own personal experiences here and just different modalities that we can lean into if that's the season that you're walking through in postpartum. So welcome, Michelle. Thank you so much for being on with me today. I was going to talk just for a second about how suffering does, when you're walking through it and you do feel like everything is wonky and weird and you've lost your grid and you don't know how to get back to it, right? It has a way, and I think partly because the Western, evangelical church doesn't do a great job of talking about suffering on a regular enough basis that we, most of us are looking for relief from our suffering through our faith, not recognizing that God, you read the Bible and it's like suffering everywhere. You know what I mean? Like everybody went through it. Everybody went through it. I was talking to my husband about how we read the story of Joseph and we read it's like chapter 1, chapter 2. There's like 2 chapters, right? But it spanned how many years of his life did he actually have to endure suffering? Like 17, I think, before he actually got released. Right. And yet we are not doing a great job. And I don't mean this with any judgment, but I'm saying this, as somebody who's walked through a lot of stuff, that I think we could do a much better job of helping people to understand that suffering, what is it? The presence of pain does not equal the absence of God.
Right.
The presence of suffering does not equal the absence of God. And most of my profound encounters with the Lord have happened in a place of suffering.
Agreed.
They have not been on these glorious, I love the mountaintops. Those are awesome. Right. Praise God for those, right? It's like a breath of fresh air when you need it.
Need them from time to time.
Yeah, we do. It's like I need the windows to open so I can breathe here a little bit. But at the same time, it's like we get to lean into a part of his nature and character that we don't really get access to at any other time.
It's true.
And I'm not saying that God ordains our suffering. I don't believe that personally. I don't believe that, God is out here rationing out pain and suffering and depression and anxiety. We know that's not who he is. But I think if we cut ourselves off from it in that moment and we start to think, I can only experience God when I'm happy, when I'm joyful, when I'm whatever, that's not biblical, number one. And number 2, we're actually cutting ourselves off from the source that's going to help us get through this really dark, scary thing that we're walking through. And recognizing that God has other people that he wants to bring as part of our story, as part of our healing. And I think this is a good segue of talking about how can counseling help I want to talk about EMDR and neurofeedback too, but I think how, in your perspective, because you're on the other side of the chair, you've been in the chair, you've been on the other side of the chair, right? Both.
I have, yes.
Which are beneficial. How does counseling help with when you're walking through postpartum? What kind of tools do you kind of help work people through? Talk therapy can be very beneficial as kind of a, opening the door to some of those things. So, in your perspective, how is that helpful?
It can be really helpful. It can be helpful in recognizing you're not alone. It can be helpful in because that's one of the things that I share with people who are struggling during this time is, I think there have been a few different statistics, but 1 in 5 and then 1 in 3 are the numbers that I've heard of women who deal with postpartum mental health. And so 1 in 3, if it's that, which oftentimes we do underreport versus overreport in statistics.
It's probably higher. Yeah.
That means there's many other women who are struggling alongside you during that time or who have gone through it during their own postpartum periods. And Um, that can be a little daunting, but also comforting to know you're not alone, and
Right.
to know, talk with your mom, talk with your sister, talk with a good friend. You might find that they can relate.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but also counseling, it can be helpful on some of the stuff that comes up. Like we had talked before, our story is more close to the surface.
Yes.
There might be stuff that comes up, stuff that was in your story, in your childhood, that's coming up during your postpartum that we need to address and talk about. And you need to realize as an adult and see it from an adult perspective and realize, okay, I was a child. That was unfair. Or I was a kid and I didn't have any control over that. Or,
Right.
whatever new perspective you need to have on your childhood. And sometimes that's really important to go there and to look at those things. But also sometimes we talk about, oftentimes women will feel overwhelmed by all of the tasks that they are responsible for.
Absolutely. Yep.
And so we just talk about, okay, how can we simplify this for you? Are there areas that you can just like, I don't need help. I don't need a clean house right now.
Yep.
At this period in my life, it's just going to be messy. How do we come to grips with that? How can we be
Sleep
okay with
and
it?
eat.
Yeah.
Those are the two
What do we
things.
need to
Yeah.
prioritize?
Right.
And there's some great resources in helping women come to grips with that. But having a counselor walk alongside you through that period can be really powerful and really helpful. And it
Absolutely.
happened for me. I talked about going to counseling during while I was pregnant with Jude, but I also sought therapy from someone my therapist in high school,
Okay.
when I dealt with some stuff during that time. And then again, after postpartum period, worked with her for what was coming up during that time too. And it was really, really helpful. We did some EMDR and I found that to be really useful as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, it's so good. And I think, for me, for my personal experience, you touched on this too, but having somebody to like, because your thoughts, they're not your thoughts. Like they're not entirely within your
Mhm,
control during that time. They're
mhm,
largely driven, by hormones, lack of sleep,
mhm.
whatever lack of support that you're not getting, that can also add into it as well. Um,
Right.
and so it's really helpful to kind of use that space to process through some of that, and then it can be challenged, right? Where they can
Mhm,
challenge a new perspective or
mhm,
challenge
mhm.
a new thought of like, hey, did you ever consider that maybe you're not failing and maybe this is just really
Right.
like,
Exactly.
and all of a sudden
It's
you're
really,
like,
really hard.
oh, why am I having a hard time acknowledging that this is
Mhm.
hard? Like, and then you can
Yeah.
you can kind of dig into some of those larger, maybe more, more of a growth mindset, I think, within that.
Mhm, mhm.
For me, EMDR was also really helpful because I had some stuck, like very sticky traumas that were just kind of there. Um, that for me, I actually don't think it was my first counselor that I think I figured this out somehow on my own because my counselor wasn't trained in EMDR at the time. And I was like, gosh, I'm having some like very, like, I can't think my way out of this,
Mhm,
if that makes
mhm,
sense.
mhm.
I can't
Yeah.
apply a better thought to it. It's still just there. It's still just stuck.
Mhm.
So for you as a practitioner, what are some ways that you can identify that when somebody's in the room, you're working with them in counseling and maybe you've started with talk therapy and you're recognizing that there are just some things that EMDR can be very useful for. Are there certain clues that kind of help you to know when to use that tool?
When to use EMDR. Um,
Or is it kind of just a gut knowing because you've been doing it for so long?
I'm trying to think. I think some of it definitely is gut. But also, when someone is stuck, when that same thought keeps coming up and keeps coming up and keeps coming up. The other is, when we can identify, okay, that's a either big T trauma or little T trauma. When either I can hear their story and go, oh, I bet that's really significant in their story. Or they can say, this is a really significant part of my story.
Yep.
And oftentimes I'll make note, like, that might be something we want to do EMDR on. And I'll write it in my notes so that we can come back to it later if they're not at a place at that moment to do it, or we already have decided to do something else for that day and we want to plan it for the following week or, another time.
Yeah.
So it's collaborative, and that's how I tend to be as a therapist, is fairly collaborative with my clients. I tend to want to work with them where they're at and what they're wanting to deal with. So sometimes I see something and they're not quite there yet. I might bring it to their attention. And if they're ready to go there, once I brought it to their attention, then we do. And then sometimes I bring it to their attention, they're not ready, and that's okay.
Right.
EMDR is most effective when that stuff is
hot on the surface.
Naturally, when it's naturally coming up. So if I'm the one dragging it out of them, it's not going to typically be nearly as effective.
I can imagine that. I'm thinking of, most of the times that I've had EMDR, it's been very much like at the surface. It's kind of pressing all the buttons, right? And I'm like, ooh, yep, I'm in a space where this needs to be dealt with. And that's the beauty of that tool, though, I think, I'm not a practitioner in that at all, but in having utilized it for myself, is that it is typically pretty quick and effective when it is at the surface, right?
When it's up.
10 of intensity and I leave at a 1, right? And I have a much better perspective on what I'm going through, and I have a strength to lean into, as I'm going through it too. So, so one of the things, and I really want to hear your perspective on this, because I know from a biochemical, physiologic perspective, our brain actually changes in pregnancy, and it doesn't always go back to where it was. So this whole bounce back to whatever is nonsense, because it's not really humanly possible. But there are physiologic and chemical changes that happen in the brain that can lead to feelings of, panic, anxiety. For me, it was anxiety and insomnia. Those were two, just typical symptoms for me postpartum. How does neurofeedback help with that? I know it's very complex, but at the same time, it's very effective. So how would you explain that to somebody?
So it is a complex concept because there are many different ways of interacting with the brain, and there are many different modalities that are called neurofeedback.
Right.
Some that are considered clinical and some that are not. Non-clinical neurofeedback might be really effective for someone who's dealing with postpartum, but it's not a guarantee. And when it's non-clinical, you don't have a clinician overseeing it. You might have a mom or, someone without any kind of credentials kind of overseeing it. And they might have less skills to help direct them if it's not going, if it's not helpful. Or a term that we use in the field is abreaction. So sometimes we'll touch on a soft point and it kind of explodes. If that makes sense. And if you're not a clinician, you probably have no idea how to handle that. And it's really scary. Oh my gosh, I stepped on a landmine. What do I do with this person? You don't have the training to take care of that. So when it comes to postpartum, I do recommend people finding someone who's a clinician who's doing neurofeedback versus someone who's non-clinical doing neurofeedback. And then also for me, there are types of neurofeedback that are symptom-based, where you go through all the symptoms that person is experiencing, and we do have a good idea of what parts of the brain are fairly responsible for what types of behaviors. So, our executive functioning and our my brain's now spacing on where those,
of course,
other examples, but we follow the symptoms and we know where to place the electrodes in order to target those symptoms that person is experiencing. That can be a really effective type of neurofeedback. The one that I have been trained in the most is that style. It's the Othmer method. I love it. When I postpartum with Delia, that was really effective for getting my brain regulated and feeling good, and getting back on track and not dealing with the anxiety or depression that was popping up. And I would just train myself because I was a practitioner. So I'd stick those electrodes on my brain when I had a break in like a no-show or I just had a break in my schedule. I'd fit myself in. And that's kind of how I helped manage that period of time. Because I had that tool, I figured, okay, if I do have postpartum after Jude, I've got neurofeedback on board already.
Right.
Well, like you said, our brain changes, and it can change with each pregnancy. And it didn't work the second time around.
Okay.
Which was horrible. My one really
that's the worst feeling.
Tool
yeah, that's the worst feeling.
that I was banking on to get myself regulated and get me back into a good space to be able to continue being a therapist, continue being a neurofeedback practitioner, wasn't working, and I didn't know why. Well, God has amazing timing. He's awesome. Literally, I think I had just found out I was pregnant. No, it had to have been before, because we found out we were pregnant and then there was lockdown. So right before the lockdowns, in December, we had one of Josh's mentors in neurofeedback. We hired her to come out and train our small clinic and a few other people from other local clinics to do what is called brain mapping. She's an awesome trainer. And so she just taught us how to hook someone up, how to measure, where to place all of the electrodes if you're doing it by hand. Some people will use these really cool caps, and I think we do more now, use those caps. She taught us how to do it the old school, real hard way, so that you can make it more simple, but know how to do it.
That's smart.
And then, and then she helped us to some degree look at the raw EEG information and see like what's going on in there. So this is a new aspect of neurofeedback at that point that we were getting involved in. And Josh is the type of person that wants to help every person, and he wants to do it at the highest level possible.
Excellence. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I love that. And I have been challenged by him in that, to not settle for 80%, but let's strive for 95, 100.
100%. Yeah.
Keep going. If there is one client that we see and we can't figure it out, let's keep problem solving until we can help figure out how to help that person.
Right.
So we were delving into brain mapping, and then the lockdowns and getting pregnant and postpartum and panic coming up and trying neurofeedback, my old system, and it wasn't working anymore. And Josh had this whole time been intensively learning brain mapping and finding mentors who were excellent in the field, who could train him and help him look at the raw EEG to be able to identify, okay, what does this mean about this person's brain, and what type of neurofeedback is most effective to help this person.
Wow.
And right at the same time, my highest tool is not working. So we did a brain map on my brain, and effectively my brain was med resistant, and which actually had tried, gone on some medication because things were so hard. I needed some support. So I got into therapy,
you went to the tools you know, the tools you know, right?
Went to my naturopath, got on a whole bunch of vitamins, got on some medication, and it wasn't working. So I was a brain that was med resistant, and also the type of neurofeedback that I had been doing before that had worked just wasn't going to be the same type of neurofeedback my brain needed going forward. So having that brain map allowed me to find a new protocol that ended up being really effective. And so there have been a few tweaks. I've done a few other brain maps along the way to kind of see my progress and
Right.
determine, okay, how have
We
things
need to focus
adjusted?
now. Yeah.
Exactly. To keep on top of how my nervous system is developing.
Right.
And that has been really effective. But I just find it fascinating, the timing of it, of
Right.
how
That is amazing.
if it
And
had any earlier, I wouldn't have had that tool. I wouldn't have had brain mapping to figure out how else to support my nervous system.
right, which I mean, it's amazing that you can see med resistance on there because I think one, that would save people so much frustration when they're trying to
Mhm.
access the supports that are available. And we know that medication is sometimes needed for these things, right?
Yeah,
But
exactly.
there are people like me that have had a lot of side effects from,
Mhm.
where it's like this should be working and it's not. And I don't know why it's not. It's worked in the past and now it's not working now, but that's because our
Yeah.
brains, and our nervous systems, like you said, they do change.
Mhm.
And what worked biochemically 10 years ago, 5 years ago in your former pregnancy, it may not be the thing that you need. And so I love that you guys have those tools and that you are helping so many people with it because I think it's, anytime we can offer hope, I think
Mhm.
to healing, right? Hope to,
Yeah.
hey, it might take a while, like it might take some time, but
Mhm.
we have something that we know based on X amount of clinical data, right? And
Yeah.
all of the, anecdotal studies and all of our own clinical experience and all of the studies that have actually been done on neurofeedback that we can help you.
Mhm.
And, it may be one piece to the puzzle, it might be the whole puzzle.
Mhm.
And
Right. Yeah.
and I think that goes into because I know I am over over your time today, and you probably need to get back to your family. But I think this leads into the thing that we kind of wanted to touch on, which is really how to find a good practitioner if you're looking for. Maybe we'll just land on like specifically neurofeedback, um, because that one's kind of it's newer. I think it's not in everybody's realm of understanding.
Right.
How would somebody know? Like, because I've had friends that have done neurofeedback and they're like, it was a
Mhm.
horrible experience. And I've only ever had a good experience with neurofeedback.
Mhm.
I really think by the divine hand of God, because both of them were just like the timing of it, like you said, was like, this is uncanny and weird. Like, how did that just land in
Yeah.
my lap,
Mhm.
But I think if somebody knows about it and they're wanting to search for it, or they're maybe looking for a therapist, in postpartum that does both,
Yeah.
how would you know as a person coming in that that person might be a good, solid, like really good practitioner?
Yeah. So there are some certifications in the field that help with identifying at least someone who's gone above and beyond to make sure that they've gotten extra classes under their belt, because neurofeedback is actually unregulated in most states. And so that means that really anybody can provide neurofeedback.
It's a little bit
The
frightening.
it is a
A
little
little
bit
bit.
frightening. At least according to the state, anybody can.
Okay.
The distributors of the equipment are the ones who kind of regulate, and so
Okay.
many distributors don't allow anyone without a license to buy it, and so
Okay.
that's kind of
That's
how it's
good.
regulated. So there's some regulation, but it's not perfect. There are people who get a hold of the equipment and don't have any credentials at all and don't have any training, and that's really dangerous to try and work with someone
100%.
who doesn't have any knowledge of what they're doing. um,
Yeah.
so finding someone who has BCIA certification, and the credentials for that would be BCN, is
Okay.
one
Board
step
certified.
to,
Yeah.
to help. Yeah, board certified in neurofeedback, I think,
Neurofeedback.
is what it
Okay.
stands by for. So uh, they've since changed some of the neurofeedback words over to neuro regulation, I think.
Oh,
So
okay.
ISONAR is one of the conferences, people that put on research and in our field, and it used to stand for the N used to be neurofeedback and now it's neuroregulation. So I'm not sure if that's going to be a trend where we're changing that term or not, but I think it was just to try and be inclusive of other modalities that also are influencing the brain. But anyway, the BCN or BCIA is the organization, is a good place to start. There are practitioners like myself who've been working in the field and don't have that credential. My husband, Joshua, does. And he's part of my clinic, and he and I work together. And so I think that gives our clinic a little bit of status. I feel like that's the wrong word.
Credibility.
Maybe. Thank you.
Yeah.
Credibility. And I would love to work towards getting that credential, but at the moment, being a mom and all the hats that I hold, prevented me from doing that so far. So that's one place to start, but also asking them, do you have a license? Are you licensed? Asking them, how many modalities do you use? If they only use one, that one might be great, but I, as an individual, tend to like the idea of, not all tools are going to fit each person. If they're willing to learn more than one tool, then they are probably going to be more of a mind that, if this one doesn't work, we'll try this one. They're going to be more of a problem solver rather than, oh, I don't understand why this is not working for you. It works for all my other clients. I guess, sorry, out of luck. Which,
the worst thing to say to somebody, honestly.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
So we wouldn't want a practitioner who's doing that. That doesn't mean someone who only knows one system wouldn't be a good one. To go with. But there's also the, which I think we talked about before we started recording, or maybe we did at the beginning, but the non-clinical versus clinical.
Yes.
And that we would want, especially if you're dealing with postpartum, someone who is clinical. So those would be my recommendations for helping you find.
No, that's really good. And I think, and I think especially usually when somebody's entering therapy or they're in need of something, right? Like they're not coming in maybe in their best place, right? And so I think we have to be, in my opinion, the practitioners that I have loved working with the most are the ones that they're confident in what they do, but they're humble enough to know and say, like, whatever I see, if I'm not able to help you, I'm going to find somebody that can help you.
Right.
I'm going to find the modality that can help you. I'm aware of my own either clinical or personal limitations.
Exactly.
And they're not opposed to me asking questions like, have you ever worked with this kind of issue? What do how would you handle it if, let's say, somebody's coming in for panic attacks, right? Because you're already in like not a great place when that's happening, and the flexibility is not there for mistakes, right? On the part of the practitioner. So for me, if I was coming in for that, or maybe like migraines or something like that, I would want to know that the question I would ask is, okay, if, let's say we get in there, because I'm already probably highly anxious if I'm coming in for panic attacks. If this makes things worse, how do you navigate around that? These are all really appropriate questions, I feel like, to ask any practitioner that you're working with. And there should be no resistance to the question. A practitioner, I find, that is resistant to the client really being autonomous and advocating for themselves, it's going to be hard to build trust in that place. And I think you guys do such a good job with that. I know I had like a million questions before I started neurofeedback, and I have a history of doing it. I know that it's worked, but it's a different system and it's a different problem now. And so you guys have been great with that and just answering.
I'm glad to hear it.
Well, and I know that's who you are, because I know who you are, but at the same time, I think for the people listening, I want them to hear that too, that there should be, like you said, that collaboration that happens when you're working with somebody. So this was such a fun conversation, Michelle. I feel like we could talk about this for a really long time.
I agree.
But I love that we talked about the faith aspect. I'm going to put some of those resources in the show notes for those of you that are listening. how that's informed your work as a therapist,
Yeah.
how you reached out for help for yourself and kind of broke through that shame barrier,
Mhm.
and the different tools that you use. So I will
Mhm.
also make sure to put in the show notes how people can contact the clinic if they're needing support and help.
Yeah.
Um, there was one, what was the organization? We talked about this and I totally forgot to write it down. The postpartum organization
Oh,
that
yeah.
you're a part of.
Postpartum Support International. So I'm not necessarily a part of it, but I've taken trainings from them. Um, and they have some great resources online that are free or very low cost to support women who are struggling with postpartum mental health of any kind. Um,
Amazing.
yeah.
Okay. I will put that in there. But thank you so much for taking the time with me today. I'm excited
Mhm.
for the listeners to get to hear from you and hear your, your personal and your professional experience. And I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrea. I had a good
You're
time.
welcome.